This document proves you're in breach of contract.
No!
That paper is meaningless, David. Get out of this building now. We will not be intimidated.
The sound of Sienna's dignity shattering was quieter than the roar of the New York subway. But to Julian, it was the sweetest music he'd heard all year as he snatched the tattered pet carrier from her hands and held it over the edge of the fourth-floor balcony. He didn't see a woman who had spent her last dime to keep this roof over her head. He saw poor black lady, whose presence was an eyesore in his new luxury development, and he was determined to erase her before the sun went down. Sienna screamed, her voice raw and desperate, reaching for the carrier where a sleek, jet-black cat named Midnight sat in terrifying silence, his golden eyes fixed on Julian with a gaze that felt ancient and judgmental. Julian laughed, a jagged, cruel sound that cut through the humid New York air, and he told the crowd gathered on the sidewalk below that this was what happened when nobodies forgot their place in his city. If you believe that those who bully the vulnerable should face the ultimate reckoning, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with us until the end. Because Julian is about to learn that some cats have owners who can buy and sell his entire bloodline before lunch. He leaned further over the railing, the carrier swaying dangerously, and he taunted Sienna, asking her if her stray mutt could fly, his face twisted into a mask of Ivy League arrogance that made the onlookers hiss with rage. But the laughter died in his throat when a sudden, oppressive silence fell over the street, a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the block. A fleet of 3 matte black SUVs, windows darker than the midnight sky, screeched to a halt at the curb, boxing in Julian's parked Lamborghini with a precision that suggested military training. Julian froze, his hands still gripping the carrier, as the doors of the vehicles opened in perfect, lethal synchronicity and 6 men in tactical gear stepped out, their faces obscured by ballistic masks. They didn't look at the crowd, and they didn't look at the building, they looked at the cat. Sienna collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But she wasn't looking at the guards, she was looking at the lead car, where the back door was being opened by a man whose silhouette alone commanded the respect of every boardroom in Manhattan. It was Xavier Thorne, the deadliest billionaire in New York, a man who had built an empire on cold steel and even colder calculations, and he was currently staring at the fourth-floor balcony with a look of such profound, murderous intent that the temperature on the street seemed to drop 20 degrees. Julian's arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, slimy dread that traveled up his spine, as he realized that the man he had spent years trying to impress was now looking at him like a specimen under a microscope. Xavier didn't yell. He didn't have to. He simply pointed a single, gloved finger at Julian and whispered a command into a lapel mic that sent the tactical team charging into the building like a swarm of hornets. Julian scrambled back from the railing, finally pulling the carrier onto the solid floor of the hallway. But he was too late to hide his crime. The door to the apartment didn't just open, it was erased from its hinges, the wood splintering into 1,000 shards as the guards flooded the room, pinning Julian to the wall before he could even let out a whimper. Sienna rushed to the carrier, sobbing as she pulled Midnight into her arms, the cat purring with a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to signal the start of a war. Xavier Thorne stepped into the room moments later, his presence filling the small space until Julian felt like he was being crushed by the sheer weight of the billionaire's shadow. He walked past Julian as if the man were nothing more than a stain on the carpet, stopping only when he reached Sienna and the cat. He reached out a hand, his touch surprisingly gentle as he stroked Midnight's head, and he looked at Sienna with an expression that was part gratitude and part terrifying resolve. He told her that he had been searching for this cat for 3 months, the only thing his dying daughter had asked him to protect, and that the man who had laid a hand on it was about to discover the true meaning of the word. Eviction. Julian tried to speak, to offer an apology or a bribe, but the words died in his throat as Xavier turned to face him, his eyes two shards of frozen glass. The billionaire informed Julian that by the time he reached the ground floor, his bank accounts would be frozen, his properties would be seized, and his reputation would be a smoking ruin in the middle of Wall Street. But that was only the beginning. The air in the apartment didn't just feel cold, it felt chemically altered, vibrating with the silent, digital execution of Julian's entire existence as he watched his smartphone screen flicker and go dark, a black mirror reflecting his own terrified, sweating face. Xavier Thorne didn't move a muscle, standing like a dark monolith amidst the wreckage of the room, while his security team moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency that made Julian feel like a ghost in his own hallway. Julian tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry New York glass, and he managed to whisper a plea for a second chance, a deal, anything to stop the invisible scythe that was currently harvesting his assets. But Xavier didn't do second chances. He did total annihilation, and he simply checked his watch, a piece of engineering that cost more than the building Julian had been so desperate to gentrify, and remarked that Julian had exactly 3 minutes of relevance left on this earth. Outside, the sounds of the city seemed to warp and distort, the honking of taxis and the distant hum of the subway becoming a backdrop to the high-stakes execution happening in apartment 4C, while Sienna stood by the window, her hand trembling as she stroked Midnight's fur. The cat was no longer shying away. He was perched on her arm like a feathered king, his golden eyes locked on Julian with a predatory satisfaction that seemed to mirror Xavier's own cold resolve. Julian's knees finally gave out, and he hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud, the impact sending a puff of dust into the air that shimmered in the late afternoon sun like the ashes of his career. He started to babble about his family, about the investors in Maryland and Connecticut who were counting on this deal, but Xavier cut him off with a voice that was a low, melodic rumble of pure, unadulterated power. The billionaire informed Julian that those investors had already been contacted, and that by the time Julian reached the lobby, every single one of them would have signed a document disavowing any association with his firm. It wasn't just a business move, it was a surgical removal of a cancer, a demonstration of what happens when a scavenger tries to hunt in the territory of a wolf. Sienna watched the man who had tried to throw her life off a balcony crawl toward Xavier's feet, and she felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Not revenge, but a profound, grounding sense of justice that made her spine feel like steel. She didn't want the penthouse or the money Julian had offered in his panic. She wanted the world to know that she wasn't a nobody, and that the kindness she had shown to a broken cat was worth more than all the glass and steel in Manhattan. Xavier looked at her then, his gaze softening by the smallest of margins, and he told her that the deed to this building was currently being transferred into her name, but not as a gift, as a settlement for the emotional distress caused by a man who didn't understand the value of a soul. Julian let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, his mind finally snapping under the weight of the realization that he was being replaced by the woman he had called a charity case. But his laughter was silenced by the heavy hand of a guard on his shoulder. He was hoisted to his feet, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with the floor's grime, and led toward the door like a prisoner being marched to the gallows while the crowd outside began to cheer, having sensed this shift in the atmosphere. But the real nightmare for Julian was just beginning, because as he was led out of the room, he saw the second car waiting, a white van with government plates and men in dark windbreakers who didn't look like they were interested in real estate. Xavier leaned in close to Julian, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and cold authority, and whispered that the Iron Gate conglomerate he worked for was being liquidated as they spoke, and that his name was at the top of the indictment list for federal fraud. The look of pure paralyzing horror on Julian's face was the most cinematic thing Sienna had ever seen. A moment of absolute truth where the predator realized he had been nothing more than bait for a much larger trap. As the door to the apartment finally closed on Julian's old life, Xavier turned to Sienna and told her that they needed to move, because while the battle for the building was won, the war for the pack was only just heating up. He revealed that Midnight wasn't the only thing the Iron Gate wanted, and that by saving the cat, Sienna had inadvertently become the guardian of a secret that could topple every power structure from New York to California. Sienna looked at the cat, then at the billionaire, and she realized that her life as a poor lady was over, replaced by a destiny that was as dangerous as it was dazzling. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on Midnight, and followed Xavier Thorne out into the bright, well-lit chaos of the New York afternoon, knowing that the world was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the power of the marginalized. But what she saw waiting for her in the lobby changed everything. The elevator doors slid open with a hiss that sounded like a predator's warning, revealing a lobby that had been transformed into a battlefield of flashbulbs and high-end security. Sienna felt Midnight's claws dig slightly into her shoulder, a silent anchor as she stepped into the chaos. But it wasn't the press or the police that stopped her heart. It was the man standing in the center of the marble floor, flanked by a phalanx of lawyers who looked like they were carved from the same cold New York stone as the building itself. This wasn't Julian. This was David, the shadow CEO of the Iron Gate and the man who had pulled the strings of the city's displacement for decades. And he was currently looking at Sienna with a hunger that had nothing to do with real estate and everything to do with the black cat purring against her neck. Xavier Thorne didn't break his stride, his hand moving to the small of Sienna's back to guide her forward, his presence a shield that seemed to ripple through the air like heat over asphalt. David didn't offer a greeting, he offered a challenge, his voice a smooth, oily baritone that made the hair on Sienna's arms stand up, as he claimed that the cat was stolen property and that the lady was a conspirator in a high-stakes corporate theft. The crowd of neighbors who had been cheering for Sienna's victory moments ago fell into a confused, murmuring silence, the weight of David's accusations hanging over them like a toxic cloud. If you think the truth is always a simple line between right and wrong, then you haven't seen how the elite play the game, so stay focused because the next 60 seconds will rewrite the entire script of this war. David stepped forward, a legal document in his hand that bore the official seal of the District of Columbia, and he declared that Midnight carried a proprietary biological sequence that belonged to the Iron Gate's research division, a lie so bold it made Xavier's jaw tighten until the bone was visible through his skin. The billionaire stopped inches from David, the two most powerful men in the state of New York standing like tectonic plates about to collide, while Sienna realized that her stray cat was the center of a conspiracy that reached into the very labs where the future of medicine was being bought and sold. Xavier whispered that David had overplayed his hand, and that trying to claim a living creature as intellectual property was the act of a desperate man watching his house of cards catch fire. But David wasn't looking at Xavier. He was looking at a woman standing in the back of the lobby, a woman Sienna recognized with a jolt of pure, agonizing betrayal. It was her own sister, Sandra, who was supposed to be in Maryland. Sandra wouldn't meet her eyes, her gaze fixed on the floor as she clutched a designer handbag that Sienna knew she could never afford. And the realization hit like a physical blow to the stomach. The eviction hadn't been an accident. It had been a setup designed to force Sienna out so the Iron Gate could retrieve the cat without Xavier Thorne's interference, and her own flesh and blood had been the one who had pointed the wolves to her door. The tension in the lobby shifted from corporate to personal, a visceral, bleeding wound of a moment that made the air feel too thin to breathe. Sienna felt a surge of hot, righteous anger replace her fear, and she stepped out from behind Xavier's shadow, her eyes locking onto Sandra's with a fire that made the traitor flinch. She didn't scream or cry. She simply told David that a cat doesn't have a proprietary sequence. It has a soul, and that the only thing he would be taking from this lobby today was a lawsuit that would bury him under the weight of his own greed. Xavier let out a short, sharp laugh of genuine admiration, realizing that Sienna didn't need his protection as much as the world needed her voice, and he signaled to his head of security to initiate the Phoenix Protocol. Within seconds, every screen in the lobby, and every smartphone in the crowd, erupted with a video leak from the Iron Gate's internal servers, showing David himself discussing the disposal of the cat and the woman who protected it. The staircase of suspense had just reached its first peak, and David's legal team began to back away from him as if he were radioactive, their loyalty evaporating the moment their own reputations were on the line. But David wasn't finished, and he whispered something to his lead guard that made Xavier's team tense their hands over their holsters, a hidden threat that suggested the Iron Gate had a backup plan that didn't involve the law. He looked at Midnight and told Sienna that some secrets were too heavy for a nobody to carry, and that by the time she reached the safe house in Maryland, she would be begging him to take the burden off her hands. The threat hung in the air like a curse, a promise of a pursuit that would cross state lines and leave a trail of wreckage in its wake. Xavier grabbed Sienna's arm, his movement urgent and calculated, as he told her they were leaving now, not because they were afraid, but because the lobby was about to become a crime scene. As they pushed through the heavy glass doors and toward the waiting SUVs, Sienna looked back one last time at Sandra, seeing the regret on her face. But she didn't look for forgiveness, she looked for the next move. She realized that the Deadliest Billionaire wasn't just her savior, he was her partner in a game where the stakes were nothing less than the truth itself. But that was only the beginning. The roar of the SUV's customized engine was the only thing louder than the pounding of Sienna's heart as they tore through the dark, winding corridors of the New Jersey Turnpike, the lights of passing cities blurring into long, white streaks of neon panic that felt like they were being dragged toward the Maryland border by an invisible, vengeful hand. Chris, Xavier's lead driver and a man whose hands moved over the steering wheel with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon, didn't look back as he navigated the heavy vehicle through a sea of midnight traffic, his eyes constantly scanning the thermal HUD projected onto the windshield for the telltale heat signatures of the Iron Gate's pursuit teams. Sienna sat in the back, her fingers buried deep in Midnight's thick, obsidian fur, feeling the cat's heart racing in perfect, rhythmic sync with her own as the dark silhouettes of three matte black sedans flickered in the side mirrors, closing the gap with a lethal, predatory intent that made the air inside the cabin feel like it was being compressed by a hydraulic press. Xavier was hunched over a glowing tablet in the seat beside her, his sharp features illuminated by the cold, flickering blue light of a dozen scrolling data streams, his thumb hovering over an encrypted execute command that could erase a man's digital footprint in seconds, and he told Sienna that the cat wasn't just a pet, he was a biological hard drive, carrying a neural mapping sequence that his daughter had developed before she died, a sequence that could revolutionize neurorecovery or be weaponized into the ultimate tool of cognitive control. This was why her sister had sold her out, why Sandra had traded 20 years of shared memories and Sunday dinners for a glimpse of the hollow, gilded world that lived in the shadows of the billionaires, and the weight of that betrayal felt heavier and more suffocating than the G-forces pulling at Sienna's chest as Chris took a sharp, screaming turn onto a service road. If you believe that blood should be thicker than water, but you've seen how quickly gold can turn a sibling into a stranger, then hit that subscribe button right now because the rabbit hole of this betrayal goes deeper than the Maryland soil we're racing toward. Chris grunted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, as he informed Xavier that the Iron Gate had activated a digital blackout zone ahead, meaning they were about to lose their satellite link and their ability to track the drones that were currently hovering 3,000 feet above them like mechanical vultures waiting for a carcass. Sienna looked at Xavier, her voice trembling but her eyes filled with a new, dangerous resolve that she hadn't known she possessed, and she asked him if he really intended to use the code inside Midnight to destroy the people who had killed his daughter, or if he was just another monster wearing a better suit than David. Xavier didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cat, the golden-eyed creature that was the only living thing left in the world that remembered the sound of his daughter's laugh, and he whispered that sometimes you have to burn the entire forest down just to make sure the wolves have nowhere left to hide. The tension inside the car was a physical thing, a vibrating wire stretched to the breaking point. As the SUV suddenly lurched, the sound of a high-velocity impact echoing through the frame as one of the pursued vehicles rammed their rear bumper, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky like a dying firework. Chris didn't panic. He simply adjusted his grip and slammed on the electromagnetic brakes for a fraction of a second, causing the pursuer to oversteer and go spinning into the guardrail in a violent, metal-shredding crescendo that illuminated the highway in a brief, orange flash of destruction. They were nearing the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, the massive steel structure rising out of the darkness like the ribcage of a leviathan, but the HUD was showing a red tear, leaving the iron gates armored trucks stranded on the receding side of the rising bridge. But as they raced into the dark safety of the Maryland woods, a notification chirped on the dashboard monitor, a live-feed video from Sienna's old apartment in Harlem that made her blood turn to ice. It showed a man named Chris, a different Chris, one of David's tech enforcers, holding up the small, leather-bound notebook she had left behind, the one that contained the manual decryption keys for the very pack network they were trying to protect. David's face appeared on the corner of the screen, his smile a thin, surgical line of victory, as he told Sienna that he didn't need the cat to win the war, he only needed the woman who knew how to talk to it, and that he would see her at the estate sooner than she thought. Sienna looked at Xavier, the realization dawning on her that this safe house was actually the final destination of a trap they had walked into willingly, and that the man beside her might have been the one who led her there. But that was only the beginning. The iron gates of the Thorne estate in Maryland didn't swing open so much as they surrendered, the massive slabs of blackened steel parting with a low, hydraulic groan that felt like the closing of a tomb's lid behind them as Chris steered the battered SUV onto the winding, gravel-lined driveway of the secluded forest sanctuary. Sienna clutched Midnight to her chest, her knuckles white as she peered through the tinted glass at the towering pines that leaned over the road like skeletal giants, their shadows dancing in the harsh, sweeping beams of the vehicle's headlights, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the high-speed chase through the Jersey night. Xavier Thorne was a ghost beside her, his face a mask of calculated coldness as he tapped a final sequence into his tablet, trying to re-establish the encrypted link to the estate's main server, but the screen only flickered with a static-filled image of the Harlem apartment, a haunting reminder that David was already inside their minds. The SUV came to a halt in front of the massive stone mansion, a structure of glass and jagged rock that looked more like a fortress than a home, and as the engine died, the silence of the Maryland woods rushed in to fill the void, a silence so thick and heavy it made Sienna's ears ring with a phantom alarm. Chris was out of the car in a heartbeat, his weapon drawn and his eyes scanning the dark perimeter for the slightest shimmer of a thermal signature, but the estate felt abandoned, the thousands of security cameras that usually tracked every movement sitting frozen in their housings like dead eyes. Xavier stepped out, his voice a low, jagged rasp as he told Sienna to stay behind him, but she was already moving, her intuition screaming that this safe house was no longer a sanctuary but a gilded cage designed to hold her until the wolves arrived. If you've ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up because you realized the person you trusted was the one who led you into the lion's den, then don't move a muscle, because the revelation waiting behind these oak doors is about to shatter everything you thought you knew about loyalty. They entered the grand foyer, the air smelling of expensive beeswax and cold ozone, and the motion sensor lights flickered to life with a jagged, irregular pulse that suggested the electrical grid was being systematically dismantled from the inside out. Sienna looked up at the sweeping marble staircase and saw a woman standing at the top, her silhouette sharp and menacing against the backlight of the upstairs gallery. It was Elena, the estate's head of security, and the woman Xavier had trusted with his life for a decade. Elena didn't reach for her weapon, she simply held up a small, familiar object that made Sienna's breath catch in her throat. It was a duplicate of the leather-bound notebook, a shadow ledger, that Sienna had forgotten she'd even written, a book containing the one thing David didn't have, the manual override for the Thorne family's private satellite network. The realization hit Xavier like a physical blow to the solar plexus, his eyes widening as he looked from Elena to the notebook, and he whispered a single word of disbelief that was lost in the sudden, deafening sound of a helicopter's rotors thumping against the air directly above the house. Elena didn't look remorseful. She looked tired, her voice a hollow echo as she explained that David hadn't just paid her, he had threatened the lives of her children in Connecticut, proving that in the war of the billionaires, the only currency that truly mattered was fear. Sienna felt midnight tensing in her arms, the cat's low, guttural growl vibrating through her ribcage like a warning bell, and she realized that the cat wasn't looking at Elena. He was looking at the shadows beneath the grand piano, where a thin, wire-thin laser sight was currently dancing across Xavier's chest. She didn't think, she reacted, shoving Xavier hard toward the heavy stone pillars of the entryway just as a suppressed shot hissed through the air, shattering a priceless Ming vase into a million porcelain shards that rained down on the marble like frozen tears. The safe house was now a kill box, and Chris was already engaged in a firefight in the driveway, the sound of rhythmic, muffled pops signaling that David's elite extraction team had arrived to claim the biological hard drive, once and for all. Sienna scrambled behind a heavy oak sideboard, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought her chest might crack, while Xavier pulled a backup interface from his jacket, his fingers moving with a frantic, desperate speed to try and regain control of the house's automated defenses. He told her that if David got the cat, the neural mapping sequence would be used to create a digital backdoor into every high-security mind in the country, turning the world's leaders into nothing more than puppets for the Iron Gates board of directors. But that was only the beginning of the horror, because as the lights in the foyer finally failed, plunging them into a terrifying, obsidian darkness, the voice of David boomed through the estate's intercom system, sounding like the voice of a god coming down from the heavens. He told Sienna that he didn't want the cat anymore, he wanted her, because the neural map was incomplete without the unique brainwave signatures of the person the cat had bonded with, a biological handshake that only she could provide. He offered her a choice that made the blood in her veins turn to slush. She could walk out of the front door and surrender herself to the Iron Gate, or she could stay and watch as his men burned the Thorne estate to the ground with everyone still inside. Xavier looked at her through the darkness, his eyes two burning embers of regret and resolve, and he told her that he would hold them off as long as he could, but that she needed to find the hidden path, through the cellar that led to the old Maryland coal mines. But Sienna didn't move toward the cellar. She looked at midnight, and then she looked at the heavy, reinforced glass of the gallery window where the helicopter's searchlight was currently scanning the room like a hungry eye. She whispered to Xavier that she wasn't a poor black lady anymore, and she wasn't a victim, and that the Iron Gate was about to discover what happens when you try to trap a queen in her own kingdom. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, high-frequency whistle she'd found in Midnight's original carrier, a tool used for training that most people would have ignored, and she blew a note so high and sharp that only the cat and the estate's automated sensors could hear it. The effect was instantaneous. The mansion's emergency fire suppression system didn't spray water. It released a dense, opaque cloud of halon gas that blinded the infrared sensors of David's men, turning the foyer into a whiteout zone where only someone who knew the layout by heart could survive. Sienna grabbed Xavier's hand and began to run, not toward the basement, but toward the very top of the house where the helipad was located, her mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations and raw, unadulterated survival instinct. She realized that the only way to end the war was to take the fight to the sky, and that David had forgotten one crucial detail about the nobody he was hunting. She had nothing left to lose, and a billionaire's empire to gain. But as they reached the roof, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy of dark coils, she saw that the helicopter wasn't there to extract her. It was there to level the building. David was sitting in the co-pilot's seat, a remote detonator in his hand, and he smiled as he told her that if he couldn't have the key, he would ensure that no one else ever could. What he did next changed everything. The thumb of David moved in a slow, agonizingly deliberate arc toward the red ignition trigger of the remote detonator, a jagged smile of triumph cutting across his face like a scar as the helicopter hovered just 30 feet above the roof of the Maryland estate. But as the mechanical click of the button echoed through the roar of the rotors, the world didn't end in a fireball of glass and stone. Instead, a deathly, digital silence settled over the roof, the lights of the helicopter flickering and dying as the entire aircraft suddenly bucked in the air, its sophisticated avionics suite hijacked by a ghost in the machine that David never saw coming. Sienna stood her ground, her feet planted wide on the concrete helipad, her eyes locked onto David's with a cold, unwavering stare that made the billionaire's blood run cold as she held up the true leather-bound notebook, the one Julian and Sandra had ignored because it looked like a simple collection of recipes. In reality, it was the analog blueprint for the neural mapping sequence, and the ledger David's men had stolen from Harlem was nothing more than a high-tech Trojan horse that had just uploaded a self-replicating virus into the Iron Gate's entire global network. If you love seeing a mastermind get outplayed at his own game by the very person he tried to ruin, make sure to like this video right now, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below telling us your favorite moment of justice, because the fall of the Iron Gate is just getting started. Xavier Thorne leaned against the reinforced vent, a trail of blood running down his temple but a look of pure, unadulterated pride on his face, as he watched the poor black lady he had rescued become the architect of his enemy's destruction. The helicopter began to spin, its tail rotor locking into a fixed position as Chris, having fought his way to the roof's control center, used the manual override to ground the craft with a bone-jarring impact that sent David sprawling across the cockpit floor. Sienna didn't wait for the dust to settle. She moved toward the wreckage with the grace of a panther, Midnight still perched on her shoulder like a guardian spirit, the cat's golden eyes reflecting the flickering emergency lights of the estate. She reached into the cockpit and snatched the remote from David's trembling hand, crushing it under the heel of her sneaker as she told him that a kingdom built on the suffering of others is nothing more than a graveyard waiting for a shovel. David tried to scramble away, his expensive suit torn and his dignity a smoking ruin, but he was met by the silent, lethal wall of Xavier's tactical team, who had finally regained control of the estate's perimeter. Elena, the security chief who had been forced into betrayal, stood at the front of the line, her face a mask of iron as she placed the handcuffs on David's wrists, her eyes silently thanking Sienna for giving her away to save her children without losing her soul. The tension of the night finally broke like a fever, the Maryland woods filling with the sounds of federal sirens and the heavy thrum of approaching transport planes, as the Iron Gate's empire began to dissolve in real time across every financial news ticker in the world. Xavier walked over to Sienna, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture of absolute partnership, and he told her that the pack wasn't just a project anymore, it was a new reality, and she was the one who would lead the foundation to restore the neighborhoods David had tried to erase. Sienna looked out over the darkened forest, the first light of a clear, golden dawn beginning to peek over the horizon, and she realized that her life would never be small again. She had crossed the bridge from victim to visionary, and she had done it without losing the heart that had made her save a stray cat in a New York alley. Sandra arrived at the estate an hour later in the back of a police cruiser, her face a mess of tears and regret, but Sienna didn't offer her a hand. She offered her a choice: to testify against the board of the Iron Gate and spend the rest of her life making amends, or to disappear into the shadow of the world she had tried to buy. As the sun finally cleared the trees, illuminating the stone and glass of the Thorne estate in a bright, well-lit glow of victory, the story of the lady and the billionaire's cat became a beacon for every person in New York who had ever been told they didn't matter. Xavier and Sienna stood on the edge of the helipad, watching the cleanup crews work, while midnight sat between them, his sleek black fur shimmering in the morning light as if he knew that the secret he carried was finally safe. If you enjoyed this journey through the high-stakes world of Melanin and the Mafia's pack, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter in our saga of loyalty, power, and ultimate justice. Sienna turned to Xavier and told him that they had work to do, not in the boardrooms or the penthouses, but in the streets where the real battles were fought, and that this was only the first brick in the new empire they were building together. The billionaire smiled, a genuine, warm expression that erased a decade of grief from his face, and he walked with her back into the house, two souls bound by a feline key and a shared hunger for a better world. The story of the eviction that failed became a legend, a warning to every predator in a suit that the person they think is the weakest might just be the one holding the match that burns their world down. And as the camera pulls back, showing the vast, beautiful expanse of the Maryland coast and the distant, shimmering skyline of New York, remember that justice isn't just something that happens, it's something you build, one act of kindness at a time. This has been the rise of the pack, and the world will never be the same again.